Hello, selectors, and welcome to my PowerPoint presentation talking about how you can make any deck good in Wixoss. Basically, how you can win with any center you possibly want to. Alright, first up, let's talk about centers, right? There's definitely some better centers that are better than others. However, using kind of this deck building trick that I've learned while I was GP grinding, I found sort of a formula that just kind of makes any deck, it makes it above average, right? So you can take any center that you want, your favorite center, probably use this formula. You'll end up being pretty good at winning with it. So here's the formula. Okay, basically this, right? Take it in. Take it in. Great. Now you guys are a pro Wixoss player. Congratulations, that's the end of this video. Everyone's happy. Clap, clap, claps. Obviously, we're probably need to talk about this a little bit more. This is basically everything I think you need to do in Wixoss in order to win any game of Wixoss ever. If you're doing anything that is not on this window right here, you are doing something that people would consider not great. There's a lot of things that you could be doing, like drawing cards, which is great, right? That's part of the consistency thing. But enter burning, right? Like, unless you're doing that specifically for a good reason that's on one of these things, probably just a cool little thing you can do, but not necessarily game winning. All of these things here, in my opinion, win games, so when you're building decks, you should probably do it. For example, turning your lrig sideways, turning your signy sideways. This is a way to kill your opponent. You should focus on that. I know it seems like it's basic, but it is how you win a game of Wixoss. What are other ways to win Wixoss? Well, you got these things called life bursts, right? You want to burst them, and you also want to make sure your opponent's bursts don't, stop your game plan. Again, very basic, but there are ways to build your decks and game plans to make sure that you are doing those things correctly. Another one is guards, right? We all love them. We all hate them. You try to draw them, and you make sure your opponent doesn't have them in hand sometimes, or is unable to use them, if you tax it or something like that. That's a great way to win a game of Wixoss. Another one's consistency. Look at that Haniel. Look at that guy. He's got a full grip of cards in his hands. This is a great way to win Wixoss. When you have consistency, you will always, always have a better deck than not. Really, 1/4 of your deck probably should be put towards consistency. And if you're not doing that, then I think your deck might be failing some basic measures. It's a lot, I know. It's surprising. The next one is when you want to pick a turn to win by, right? And then you make a game plan around that, making that thing possible, right? We had this thing called strike theory once upon a time on the channel. If you have not seen it, check it out. That's a great way to sort of understand whether or not your deck is making the bare minimum requirements to win a game of Wixoss. And the last one is when you lose, you should learn from it instead of making up excuses or bad beat stories. This is, I guess, optional. This is my personal take on it. I don't like it when people do these types of things. I have always prided myself to learn from my mistakes and be open-minded, rather than just explain why I lost the game. So I think that's also a really great way to start winning games of Wixoss. Just wanted to throw it in. Going up next, let's just real quick talk about the turn game plan, right? Turn 0 to X. This varies from deck to deck, right? But it's a very important part of the deck building process. If you can't visualize, especially with this game, which is so turn and pace oriented, if you can't visualize a way to win the game, then your deck will not win the game. So, here's just an example, right? This is, for example, some kind of mid-range type of thing to throw together. I like the Blue Archive cards, so I'm using Blue Archive mostly for these examples. This is, I think, a great way to sort of be like, okay, I get what I'm doing here, I'm moving forward, and eventually I will win this game by doing the following things. If I gain resources, then I can't be hated out of the game. If I do damage, I will win the game. If I mill, I get an extra damage and I win the game. If I protect my own life cloth a little bit, I can probably outlast some aggro decks and win the game. This is just, again, an example of a game thing. It may change from deck to deck, but really what it's going to change from is archetypes. Alright, in Wixoss, we have about 5 different archetypes to choose from. You have aggro. You also have mid-range. You also have control decks. And you have this new one, tempo. I call it new because we haven't really been able to do it very well, but recently, just recently. We started putting this formula together about how to win with tempo decks, and they're starting to show up and be very powerful. I think they're sort of almost supplanting Control's role in the meta. I think they're a good deck. The last one that we could do is combo decks. Now, maybe not, because Takara Tomy really, really hates the idea of combo decks. So there hasn't... I think, theoretically, there could be combo decks in this game. Is there combo decks? Not until Takara Tomy decides that there is. And it's been a couple of years, so I don't know. They seem very conscious about not having that be a thing. Anyways, let's talk about some of these things. I think when I've been building these decks for GP grinding, and I've been making a lot of successful decks, I have made almost a checklist in my head about building these decks. I do these without any exception, and when people ask me to review their decks, I look at this, and I decide, what kind of deck is it? Once I decide the archetype, I look at this and I have my checklist, and if it does not do one of these things, or it's missing multiple parts, I say it's an unsuccessful deck. This is what I think you need to do. You need to decide what archetype you are, and then you need to go for this type of checklist. So, if you're an aggro deck, you are a dash deck. There is no other aggro deck. You are always a dash deck. Anything that is not as fast as dash is not an aggro deck. It's a bad mid-range deck. That's just how it goes. Aggressive mid-range decks aren't good. So, don't be dangerously mid-range. Be an aggressive aggro deck. Your goal will be to win on turn 3 and 4. This is not, like, this top part is not necessarily the checkmark part. It's just, you should do it, right? Like, this is the goal of the game. Again, Wixoss is a turn-paced game, where if you are not explaining what turn you're winning on, your deck is not doing its function. Dash should be winning on turn 3 at its best, and if it has to, it will begrudgingly win on turn 4. Its goal will be to open 3 lanes a turn until they win or they die. This is to say that aggro decks don't necessarily have long game potential, but in their short game, they should be able to open up 3 lanes or offer 3 Signy damage every turn without fail. They should also be able to deal extra crush or damage. I put an asterisk on that. If you overload on that type of effect, because you're like, I'm doing it, I'm doing the aggro thing, you will lose. Again, I want to remind you that your really important thing to think of is this game plan type of thing. I didn't do the aggro deck here, but you should be thinking how to get to exactly lethal. It shouldn't be over lethal, it should be exactly lethal. And how to do it reliably. So, if you just fill your deck with nothing but Life Crush, Burst, Refresh, that damage stuff, you probably will lose the game because you're just not interacting at all at that point. The last part is to be redundant. What do I mean by this? Yes, there are ways that you could put more filtering in your deck, like I said earlier, but also aggro decks tend to just be redundant, right? With the idea of, well, if half my deck is open 3 lanes and the other half is deal, like, crush damage, right? Not exactly those ratios, but something like that. You end up being redundant. It doesn't matter if the opponent discards you down. You will naturally draw your 2 cards, and then those will happen to be your game plan. That is the pro of aggro decks. Whereas it's not super great, the longevity, it also is really hard to disrupt. So, it's consistent. Here's an example of what I think is probably the best aggro deck in the format right now. It's Dash Anj. I think this deck is a menace. I think this deck could randomly win tournaments all the time, and just will, no matter what, sometimes RNG, go on a hot streak, and take down big events. This is my most scared deck. I would consider it the boogeyman of the format, even. Let's talk about what's in this deck. Alright, so, we asked for win on turn 2 and 3, or 3 and 4, excuse me, and they open 3 lanes until they die or win. Alright, let's see if that's there. Boom, there you go. Look at all these ways that you can open lanes, right? It is a lot. Now, granted, it's not half your deck here. It is definitely a fourth, right? Including a majority of your lrig deck is currently occupying the ability to open lanes. Next up, we want to see that extra damage be possible. What do we got here? Boom. There it is. There's a lot of it. Normally, decks have some amount of extra damage, but not nearly this much, right? Anj herself offers extra damage. Chigusa offers extra damage. So does the piece that mills your opponent out, offers extra damage. This is all really great ways. And when I say extra damage, by the way, I do mean more than just 3 lrigs and, or sorry, 3 Signy and an lrig. I'm talking about multiple damages. Next, let's talk about consistency or redundancy. We see these. All right, so we've got more pieces here that help you filter exactly what you need. Granted, this deck also has a little bit of a feature where it is trying to do things like, for example, be defensive a little bit, right? So that's where some of this other stuff is going. But you can see there's quite a lot in this deck dedicated to basically always hitting consistency. And you don't need a ton of consistency when you're planning to win by turn 4 or die. So that's the aggro deck. Very easy to understand, very easy to dash. Let's talk about the next one, which is mid-range. So how do we play a mid-range deck? Well, your goal here is to probably win on turn 5. It can potentially win on turn 4. I don't think so. Normally, it's winning on turn 5 currently. So what is our 3 check marks that we're trying to make for this deck? First is the ability to open 2 to 3 lanes a turn forever. That is a remarkably different statement than the aggro deck. The aggro deck is not trying to open up 3 lanes a turn forever. Its forever is until it dies or wins. This is saying, I don't care if somehow we end up going to turn 8, I will still open up 2 to 3 lanes every turn until I win. This is how mid-range functions. It also offers some amount of additional damage. Markedly less additional damage than aggro, but might be more consistent because it has a little longer time to get those pieces, and it toolboxes probably a little bit more efficiently as well. And it's got the ability to save 1 to 2 extra damage, right? This is aside from, whenever I say it's dealing, it's saving itself from extra damage, I'm not talking about the normal arts or assists that are defensive. I'm talking about some other metric to do so. Let's look at a mid-range deck. Here we go. Here's Shiriko, right? I said I was going to work mostly with Blue Archive, and I'm intending to do so because there's a couple of repeat cards for these things. So here's Shiriko. I think it's a really good mid-range deck in the meta right now, and I think it is potentially something you want to bring to your locals and win the game. Let's talk about what's up first. The opening 2 to 3 lanes a turn forever. How do we do that? Well, here's some examples. So, Izuna has the ability to basically always come out of your enter and then always be able to assassin the opponent, right? That's a consistent damage there, no matter what. Same thing with Shiriko, right? Shiriko offers the ability to constantly do S-Lancer and threaten a game-winning state. That is what's good about Shiriko, and we can see it here as a consistency piece. The other consistency piece, and I did not mark it here just because I didn't want to overload on check marks, is if you actually look at the deck, there is a lot of ways to open up damage, right? You also have the level 3s, you've got some Lancers, you've got another thing, level 3 that minus effects, right? There's a lot of ways to do it. You've also got your Ps to open it up. So there's quite a few ways, your assists too, quite a few ways to open up lanes here that will add to the consistency. As you can see, you can pretty much always open up 2, so adding 1 more card that can open up things will pretty much always consistently open up 3 in this deck. I just didn't want to check marks at all, because I didn't want to overload you guys, but that is also one way to do it. Let's look at the next piece, which is how do we offer additional damage in this deck? Well, simply put, here you go. There's 2 ways to do it. One's mill, the other one is this other card called Wakumo. This is pretty common to see in mid-range decks, is that they'll offer some form of extra damage, either in the form of double crush or a mill damage, mill refresh, excuse me. And then they'll often have like one other card that could potentially do another damage, whether that's double crush or fancy double crush like it here is with Wakumo. That is up to your deck building discretion, but they'll often be able to toolbox it. Shiriko can toolbox very well. So it's sort of like on demand as they need it, right? They don't always go for it, but they have the ability to do so to kind of help end the game. Lastly, how do we stop additional damage from happening that isn't just our assists? Well, here you go. Yep, that's actually quite a few, right? Mid-range is not completely aggressive. It also is very defensive. It's often offering a board state that is a mixed defense and a mixed offense. So you can see with Yuka here and Mari here, things that don't die will save you life cloth. It's as simple as that. It's very simple math. It doesn't always work out that way. There's Assassin, there's Lancer in this world, but if you can stop some amount of damage in any of your turns, then that helps you win that race. In essence, I don't think mid-range is a deck that's trying to control the pace of the game, but it is trying to brute force its way through to an end game state. It is going to be different than Tempo, which we'll talk about in a little bit at the end. That is kind of more of a paced-based game. But this has a definitive game plan, it's got a consistent game plan, toolboxes, those types of things. So, that's the mid-range deck. What's another archetype that we can talk about? Control. Control is very different in Wixoss than it is in other decks, or other deck-building games anyways. Other deck-building games, Control often is this very reactive, very stall, very slow deck that tries to win. It is still slow, but not nearly as slow in our game. If you play a slow game of Wixoss, you'll just lose the game. So we're very much more proactive Control decks. We're looking to win on turn 6 or 7. I genuinely don't know if it's possible in Wixoss, at least in our current meta, to win a game of Wixoss past those turns. Might not be possible. Especially if you're building decks like I showed earlier that are designed to win the game basically no matter what. Control is marketed by these types of deck building checkboxes. It wants to offer safe, burst immune, or burst resistant damage every turn. This is to say that one of the most natural ways to do that is open a single lane for your attacks, and then be able to attack once with your Signing, and then once with your lrig. Now, there are ways that you can make that number go up. It doesn't have to be 2 damage a turn. It can be 2 damage a turn, but it doesn't have to be. For example, if you're playing a deck that has the ability to make its lrig swing twice, you can play a controlled deck with that. There was controlled Tamas often in the back of the day, which would often offer 3 damage that was very burst resistant because its lrigs, was swinging twice. You can also theoretically do it with a red control deck where you offer something like Hanyo, where you open 1 lane, but you give that thing double crush, right? Now you're offering 2 damage that's burst resistant because you don't really care what the other bursts are after this, and you do an lrig swing, that's your 3 damage. So, basically any kind of way to attack the opponent without, purposefully putting yourself in harm's way for crackback bursts is a very good tactic that you should then lean into Control with. It has a lot of defensive measures, more than mid-range for sure, more than Tempo for sure. As you'll see in a second, there's a ton of it. This is to help it get to turn 6 or 7, where it can win that grind game. It also, I wanted to put down that it grinds very, very well, but I figured killing resources, gaining resources, kind of the same thing. It's looking to destroy your opponent's resources while simultaneously gaining more resources of its own, whether that's enter, whether that's cards in hand, whether that's like some kind of snowballing effect. These are all marketed things that control decks are looking to do, and I would be looking to see where the give and take are in my deck if I was building a control deck. If I didn't see that, and it was just stall, period, right? Like it's just big walls. I don't think that's a good control deck. You should probably go back to the drawing board. The last one is that it needs to have a final winning turn. I know that's strange for a control deck that's stalling out, but the goal here is you need to be able to have 1 turn where you can do upwards to 5 or 6 damage even, right? It feels very like that's the realm of a dash deck, dash aggro deck, but it shouldn't just be the dash aggro deck. A control deck needs to have a turn where it clinches victory from the opponent, and like it's basically deny, 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 now I win the game. So if you don't have a way to build that final penultimate turn, you're not a great control deck, and you need to do it. It's kind of a last thing that I included on here. The rest pretty much only have 3 things. Anyways, let's see some of these things in action. Here's a control deck. Just won the GP. It is Azusa, right? So, we should see what Azusa is offering here. I actually spoiled some check marks. The first thing that we're offering is that safe damage, right? Azusa herself opens up 1 lane, and then also is able to swing as an lrig. So you're always doing that safe 2 damage a turn. The deck itself doesn't really feature a ton of ways like other control decks have in the past to be able to swing with your lrig twice, for example, to up the amount of damage that's done, but this is one way to get safe damage in Wixoss, and I wanted to show it off. The other way is Phalaris, right? A refresh is a safe damage. You're not going to worry about bursts from it because it's a refresh, so you have the way to potentially rack up some extra damage there, and also it's safe, right? That's something that's kind of important to mention. The next one is defensive measures. Look at how many more check marks we have for this one. Not only are we running like 6 like the other one, we are running way more than 6. We are running a total ways to defend it. You'll see Hasumi is also on there. That's because Hasumi is often bonded in this deck, which means it's a level 2 12k, so it's often resistant to a lot of damage effects like opening up lanes or getting, lancered through, stuff like that. So you'll end up seeing that Hasumi will end up being a very safe way to put out on the field, put out yourself a 12k, 12k, 12k board, maybe even higher than that, and stall out some damage. Again, if your Signy aren't killed, you're very likely to not take damage there. The last one here is going to be the last thing we're talking about, resource messing around with, gaining resources. It's a little cheating because it's like 2 of those in one, so there's a lot of check marks happening here. But as you can see, this is something that we're doing often. Hasumi is a great example here. Blowing up Enter is a really good way to do it. Discarding the opponent down is a really great way to do it. Ray is also a fantastic way, and probably should have highlighted that one, to say, hey, Ray is able to draw you cards and discard your opponent. So there's a ton of ways to do it here as well. Probably should have put a check mark also on the piece over there, because those things give you the ability to draw cards too. So without any further ado, that's a control deck, right? You should be seeing these check marks show up in your deck. Yes, not everything is a check mark, right? There's also some damage output here. There's also some, like, playing around your opponents with Suzumi. But, like, that's just how it works in these decks, right? Like, you want to make sure that the bulk of your deck is check marked off with the things that I'm talking about. Lastly, I wanted to talk about that winning turn, right? This is 5 damage if you have the ability to put it out here. Not only can you use your lrig to open up a hole, you can use your first Signy here to attack twice. You can use your Phalaris to do a refresh damage, and then you can use the Momoy I just put here because it could discard a card, right? And that's important. You can use the other card to bounce something and open up a hole and then attack through. This offers, again, the ability to deal 1, 2 damage in the front side, 3 off of Phalaris, 4 off of the open lane, and then 5 with your lrig. So you should have some turn that you could potentially put together that is your winning penultimate turn in control decks. Moving right along, let's talk about tempo decks. So I think tempo decks, personally to me as a player, I believe tempo decks are the best version of the archetype that you can potentially do in Wixoss. The reason being is that I think Wixoss as a game design lends itself to tempo. Wixoss is a game that, in my opinion, you win on a certain turn. And tempo is designed to have the best damage pace, aka it is the one archetype that I think can reliably make its win turn when it needs to be, and also control the opponent's wins turn to be a turn too late. In my opinion, that is probably the best way to play Wixoss. Although I know some people would argue with me and say that control is the best way to play Wixoss. Personally, I think this is it. Now, you'll notice that I have only one checkbox here, which is have the best damage pace. The entire concept of tempo is wrapped around having a better damage pace than your opponent. That may mean going faster than your opponent, but it also might mean slowing your opponent down. Something that I unlocked at the GP, I think, is I could see my opponent's life cloth, whether it was 5, 4, 2, 1, and I could know my pace, what it was supposed to be. How many lanes am I supposed to open? What am I supposed to do? When's the middle turn, right? These things all equate into having the best damage pace. So I'm going to break it down and make it a little bit more easier to understand. I think that having the best damage pace in Wixoss is going to include the following sort of ideology here. You'll want to be able to cycle through your deck to find either your aggro or control tools, the things that are going to slow your opponents down, or speed your own game up. And you're also going to be doing your best to discard their guards and draw yours. Yes, sometimes you're going to mess with their enter, sometimes you're going to mess with their game plan by like stripping their hand down so they have limited resources that they can work with, and then that will inevitably cause them to stumble and allow you to win a game as well. Those are all sort of byproducts of the discard guards. It's really more important that you have guards and the opponent doesn't, because by virtue of that, you have a better win rate than your opponent. You're gonna be able to block more damage than they are, and so you'll just win the game pace. Again, put 2 examples on here just to sort of highlight what that could be. Now, let's talk and see what kind of deck we're working with. This is the deck that I ran at the GP. It took a 2nd place in Swiss and 10th place as well for me. And we'll talk about why this deck functions. There's a lot of check marks that you're going to see pop up in a second. The first one when we're talking about it, is have the best damage pace. So we're going to be looking at specifically things that cause us to save on damage and our opponents It'll allow us to not take damage while simultaneously push damage on the opponent, right? So I'm going to show just 2 examples here, right? We're looking for things that are not just like lane opening, but things that add damage to our timing. So things that increase our pace. Well, Mill does that, right? Mill allows us to increase the pace of damage output that we're doing. The other way that we take less damage is we have Signy on the field that don't die, and that will stop damage. The third way that we're going to do it is with Umir Clear. This freezes the lrig. If the lrig is frozen, it can't attack. Now, you might be saying, but Andrew, isn't that the same as having a guard, so you just draw a guard and you're good? And I would argue, no. And my reasoning is because this can be a 5th guard, and that's important, right? Stopping a 5th damage on a game is important. The second reason is, don't forget dash decks and control decks often do extra damage by having their lrig swing twice. So, when you freeze an lrig, you are able to stop multiple damage sometimes with this. That was sort of a missing piece that I think a lot of people don't run. I don't think I would run an Umir Clear in a control deck. I think I absolutely would run an Umir Clear in a tempo deck. In fact, I think it's very emblematic of the tempo deck as a whole. So, that's one of the ways that you can control the damage pace of the game. The next thing is over here. We're going to be talking about how do we strip guards away, right? And the answer is, well, oh, no. Yeah. Sorry, I made a mistake. Not strip damage away. We're going to be looking for ways to cycle through our deck. Cycling is a really, really important part of most things in Wixoss, but you'll see it's much, much, much more important in tempo. In tempo decks, they have to be able to control their own pace, which means that certain cards would be dead in some matchups and better in other matchups. So what it needs to do is be able to find those tools at all points in times. Whether that's through toolboxing or cycling through its deck, usually cycling through its deck because it has a benefit of also being able to get you guards, you'll find that there's a lot of ways to do it. For example, Niru herself has 2 ways to do it. Not only does her bond allow you to cycle through your deck and draw extra cards, but her once per game also allows you to do that. Umir Clear, again, being another emblematic card, I think, of Wixoss, allows you, of tempo specifically, allows you to draw extra cards. You get rid of your whole hand to find the right cards. It just gives you unparalleled filtering to find exactly what you need. There's multiple other things that you can see with the checkboxes on this deck that allow you to also be able to filter very, very well. And yeah, so moving on, the last thing here, we're going to add those red check marks here. This is the discarders. All right, there we go. So this allows you to basically say, I am never letting my opponents have guards. Often with random discard. I highlighted over Niru to show this off. But also Koyuki will allow you to do random discard on your opponents. And that will inevitably allow you to strip guards more efficiently. But there's also a lot of raw discard happening as well that allow you to do that. This is a great way to play a tempo deck, right? You're going to try to do all these types of things. Now, I know tempo is probably the hardest of these, in my opinion, to get, because it plays like mid-range, it plays like control, it plays like aggro in many different matchups. It really does play whatever it needs to play in order to win that pace game, and sometimes it's any 3 of those, right? So the easiest way to understand it is I wanted to highlight a specific card in this deck. Now, I don't think Toki is an amazing card by any stretch, but I think that also highlights a thing that is a problem with tempo. It is never super powerful in what it's doing, but because it really, really, really depends on its flexibility to get itself there. And I think Toki is not a powerful card. I do think it's an incredibly flexible card. So I put some highlights on here. So for example, it is able to open up a lane. That's where you got the sword. Its shield is, it can be a 10k, which is tough to kill. So that would save you some life cloth against red decks, for example. It can gain you cards. I know it doesn't necessarily gain you cards because you're discarding a card to make it a 10k, but it filters, if you want to think about it that way, because by virtue of making it a 10k, it stays alive on the field, which means that it could potentially gain you enter, because if it's still in the field, you can use that to enter and just keep the cards in hand that you have. That's also a common trait that Toki was using at the GP. The other thing is its bond often makes your opponent low on cards in hand. You would bond it in the matchups where killing their hand is really important, like for example, control. And having that option there is really good. Not to mention, if it vanishes a Signy through battle, you can do these things where it's vanishing a Signy in front of it and then opening a different lane that isn't its lane. That means that you're killing 2 cards. That means that your opponent needs to replace 2 cards, which means it's theoretical discard because it's less cards they have to work with overall. So, Toki's just a really great example of how tempo decks often function, I think, is that highlight on that flexibility of pace control. Now, let's talk about the last thing that you can do in Wixoss. Combo. I think that this archetype is a way to do it. Basically, your the turn that you win doesn't really matter because your life cloth is your timer. You got to win before you're at 0 life cloth and then die. You try to cycle through your deck to find your combo or your engine pieces easily, and then you play things that will protect your combo or engine pieces. Oh, sorry. Takara Tomy showed up. He told me to stop talking. So, I guess that's it for combo. Look, if you want to win with any center lrig, even the ones that I often say is quote-unquote a bad center lrig, you can. Don't just stubbornly refuse to listen to advice, though. I do think that there is a specific formula you can use to unlock the potential with any lrig possible and then start getting wins at your local level. You want to start with picking your favorite center, or a good one, right? You can pick just a style that you like playing, and then use that lrig. After that, you want to figure out what archetypes work with that center. They don't all work with each other, so you want to find which one works the best. After you do that, you build it off of the checklist that I provided in this deck, or in this video. Then you want to make your turn 0 through X game plan, just to make sure that the deck you're building is consistently doing that type of thing. After that, you fill the deck out with the rest, which is filtering, so that you can make sure that you are hitting that consistent game plan. And then after that, congratulations, you start winning games. I think that is the bare minimum ways to start winning games more than losing games in Wixoss. Thank you for my TED Talk. I hope you guys all flip life bursts, but if you don't, make sure you build your decks correctly.